Hey listeners, it's your host Abir Sikder, aka Bengali Dove. February is Youth Leadership Month, and I'm thrilled to bring you a conversation with the youngest guest ever featured on Local Global Leaders. This episode is titled, It's Complicated, But It Worked Out, and I spoke with Nicholas Hazelett, a Morehead State University student, chair of the Johnson County Democratic Party, and Paintsville, Kentucky City Council member. Councilmember Hazelett is a proud Eastern Kentuckian, and at his young age, he's already stepped into public service in the very community where I grew up. We dug into everything from accountability and leadership to how he navigates party politics, to how he stays independent in his leadership style, and perhaps most importantly, the deep family roots that shape his commitment to uplifting Eastern Kentucky and Johnson County. You may also notice my dogs chiming in a few times in the background. They were downstairs, but were very enthusiastic to hear the conversation, and they didn't realize the recorder could pick up their enthusiasm. Now, let's get into the conversation. Greetings, listeners. This is Abir Sikder. I'm back home today in Johnson County, interviewing my first guest here in Johnson County, Councilman Nicholas Hazelett. Councilman, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So excited to have such an inspirational young leader who's leading out here in Eastern Kentucky and doing the amazing work you're doing. And I've heard, so much about the work you're doing, been following local news here. Just excited to hear when you got elected and just excited to hear your story.
Yeah, it was definitely a whirlwind experience, but I'm very glad to be able to serve my hometown that, this is the only place I've known and the place that I hope that I can, continue to serve and live in for the rest of my life. I'm one of those people that when you grow up in the mountains, it's hard to leave them. So I'm one of those folks that I'll be arrogant and I'll just live here the rest of my life, and people will just have to deal with that.
I can feel that. I got to do school out in D.C. for a while and got to live out in Memphis for a while, but I always felt like the calling to come back here, to be back in Kentucky.
Exactly. Even when I visit my family in Bristol, Tennessee or Bristol, Virginia, both sets of the family live on two different sides because the city's split. Anywhere in the Appalachian Mountains feels better than anywhere else. And just my humble opinion, it's a weird connection that a lot of people talk about. What if the semblance of place there? But this was just like anywhere else in the world. If I was from a different place, just having that comfort and that being. But there's nowhere better than East Kentucky, in my humble opinion.
That's true. Definitely true. Starting out with your story, I always like to ask my guests, what is your 6-word story? 6 words you'd use to describe yourself.
It's complicated, but it worked out.
Yeah. What motivates you to be back here in Eastern Kentucky, but overall, what motivates you to be a leader here in your community and led you to run for office?
Well, there's things that I know in the past that we should have done that we hadn't. Whether it's revitalizing our economy beyond coal and lumber, industries we knew realistically behind closed doors were not going to last. But we, for all intents and purposes, took a blind eye to it and continued to, drill out our minds and flatten them for something that we knew was not going to be sustainable. And I'm not saying we can't be an energy capital. We most certainly are, like West Virginia. My mom's side of the family were coal miners. But, go into a community that I know has so much potential with what we have, not just for tourism and just our general history here and culture, but also dealing with the fact that, we can't lose community. I think especially since COVID, we've lost a lot of functions that small towns, I think, have taken for granted, of the amenities that we had, of the community groups, and then also just dealing with the generation behind me. I'm Gen Z, but my sister's almost 11 at the 11th of December. And, I worry for her what will happen, for most of these Eastern Kentucky communities if we don't get our act together. So it's not just preserving what we've had and what we continue to have, but, improving it to make sure we don't continue to have the population loss that we've suffered for the last 20, 30 years.
It's interesting to hear that you as a young leader, as a Gen Z leader, already thinking about future generations.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is for me is I feel as if that I could come home and I would be content. with whatever the circumstances are. But I know that when you're dealing with a generation that had, kindergarten COVID, I mean, she was managing some of those most developmental times in a child, behind a screen. I feel as if that, they were starting life at the wrong foot. And I don't feel as if that we should allow them to keep hitting speed bumps along the way. Whether it is that they have to go out for education or go out for a job because there is no possibility of staying here, that you should only have to leave Eastern Kentucky or any rural area because you want to, not because you're forced to. So that's my thing. I can be content. I can go home right now and live the rest of my days and not worry about it. But, growing up of, not expecting to have a sibling, and then when you're 9 years old, you come up with a little sister, it's always been that guiding light to me to make sure that she and others like her have that more secure future than, they were dealt.
Sounds like she's very lucky to have an older brother like you.
Yeah, I will say I don't, as many of them say, I'm kind of out of touch with what, Gen Alpha would subscribe to, all of the different references and online trends, but I try and keep up as best as possible. I already feel like I'm carbon dated at the age of 20, so it just happens that way.
Thinking about you running for office, and you've talked about that family motivation. Before college and before you ran for city council, what were your early experiences in leadership, particularly in school?
In school, I was on Paintsville's academic team. I was in choir, and then I was on student council off and on for a number of years. And when I was in elementary school up until about 7th grade, my dad was on the school board at Paintsville. So not only seeing what he contributed to our school system and just community, and him running from something where he lost a city council election by, I think it was about 4 or 5 votes, to him, being the highest vote getter for city council, that kind of gave me that security and that confidence to do it. Because if he can do it, then I might as well give it a shot. But also just seeing, when you graduate in the high school class of 46 people, you have to compromise, because if you don't know somebody, you're just avoiding them. And if you want to do anything, especially as small as our community is, and fundraise or come up with a plan or make things better, you have to be in some kind of collective group and have a, structured goal. So I think that was just ordained to me by circumstance, going to Paintsville and going and living in a small community with a very small city school, but also just dealing with the issues at home too, dealing with a small family that always needed to, pick up a piece, whether it's, taking somebody to the doctor, taking care of groceries, making sure that they're okay, and just checking in on them. I think that just close-knit nature is really what kind of gave me the idea that, no one's coming to save us. And if we want to, change something for our region, we have to do it ourselves.
How do you balance being both a student and your leadership responsibilities on city council, and as also leading the county Democratic Party here?
It's a struggle to say the least, but I think realistically it is a good one. I think, and even when I've talked to Mayor Runyon and Tim Hall, who is my neighbor and colleague on the city council, that work-life balance is something that we've kind of lost in elected government. Typically the age in local government in these areas is around the age of 60. I'm lucky to serve with Ava Holbrook as well, who's a single mom that's, taking care of the home front there with a career in pharmacy. So I think bringing that perspective means a lot. Given those challenges of population, decrease, and seeing so many, the brain drain that we're occurring. And this is not new. I mean, it has been happening for decades. I mean, even when my papa went to the University of Pikeville, that was a concern as well, because people were just now, then in the 50s and late 40s after World War II, were given the opportunity to not just be relegated to farming and coal mining and working in the railroad. They were able to go to some post-secondary option or move somewhere else for a better job. A lot of my family on my mom's side went to Dayton, Ohio, and Wabash, Indiana for factory jobs. So it's the same thing, but a different, turnkey experience for people. That was 70 years ago, but unfortunately a lot of things are still similar and common in East Kentucky of why families are put the way that they are. But that balance is something that I feel that is necessary, just because, we had a dormant Democratic Party. It had not been active since 2019. And when I went to the county convention about a month after I graduated, they said, well, we've been thinking, and we, see what you're about. They've known me since I was a kid, and they just felt as if that I had the spirit to be chair. And I told them, I said, this is not a one-man job. I'm going to need a lot of help and hands and wisdom along the way, because many of them had been chair or been within the committee, like Dr. Majasic, that taught at Big Sandy for a great number of years, and he is still a really great resource for me. It's making sure that our community, it's not really a political job to me. It is not one of, Democrats of this and Republicans of this and that kind of opposing viewpoint. It's just that we need to have a balanced politic in the United States. We can't have communities that are completely lopsided on one way or the other. Whether it's an urban area that votes 80% Democratic or it's a rural area that's voting 80% Republican. I think that we have to, rightfully, right now in the, everyone says this, the divided times that we live in, have that balance and that semblance of both sides willing to cater to every voter, whether it's a rural voter, suburban, or an urban voter. My family on my dad's side have been kind of the traditional, what would be called now a McCain Republican family. My mom's side, very much, Blue Dog Democrats, very much working class unionized Democrats of what would some people say of a dying breed, but it's still here. It's just a matter of getting those folks out to vote and continuing that relationship that Democrats have had when it comes to labor and working families. So it just goes hand in hand, in my opinion. But I know a lot of people, of course, would disagree with that fact. But, the thing is, if you want young people involved, you can't just want young people that, subscribe to your ideas. You have to be willing to allow young people to be in every space with whatever opinion they may hold.
And how much do you look at what's happening with the statewide Democratic Party and the Republican Party too, and then like the national, the DNC and the RNC, like what they're doing? Like, do you try to adhere to the DNC's guidance, or do you kind of feel like you're doing your own thing? Or
I do my own thing, and it's not to the chagrin of the DNC or the Kentucky Democratic Party, KDP. They have, within KDP, whether it's Chair Eldridge or our Executive Director Morgan Eves or any of their staff members for communications or elsewhere, have always told me to, consider and cater your party to your area. Not, the messaging of Louisville is not going to resonate in Paintsville. And even the messaging in Paintsville is not going to resonate in Louisville. We all have different abject challenges. We have different stances in life. We have different beginnings and backgrounds. You can't talk about, the importance of coal in our urban area, but you can also talk about, certain social issues in Eastern Kentucky, not because people don't agree with those fronts, but that they're coming from two different areas. And I've always said that, the Democratic Party still is, regardless of what the pundits may say with their spreadsheets and their opinions, from both beltways of California and New York, that the Democratic Party still and will hopefully continue to be that beacon for working families. I believe in the mantra that we have always stood for since Roosevelt, during the Great Depression. That is one reason why our party had such a semblance of strength for decades, up until about the 1980s when you saw slippage with Reagan and else. But I think that when you're talking about, how do you cater to people in Eastern Kentucky, you talk about the things that clearly are not being focused on right now. Right now, especially on the federal level, you're getting this kind of, what is the new term, gaslighting. Everybody loves talking about gaslighting these days, whether it's a personal relationship or messaging that's trying to convey some kind of condescending nature to people, whatever it may be, that things are cheaper than they were. And the problem is that they're not. And it's not just me saying that because that's what the Democratic Party is saying. It's just the truth. When I go to the grocery store for whether myself, for my family, for my grandparents, it is not in a place of affordability, increasing for families. One of the things that I saw the other day, people talking about the price of eggs went down, well, that's great and all, but when everything else jacked up, but also the stabilization of those prices. Eggs only went down about 5-10 cents. At the end of the day, if 5-10 cents is going to be relief for families when everything else have exacerbated their prices. Gasoline has pretty much been the only thing that has went down, but still it's about $3 a gallon. So the problem that I see with the Republican Party is not that Republican voters know it's a problem. They do. Polling has shown that they don't believe that the messaging and the promises that were made are fulfilling themselves at this moment. And we're almost a year in. And at this point, they've already talked about if it already a lame duck presidency, if things just hoping that they get better, if they're a magic ball, what if they're going to do to save it? I think the question is, why are Republican elected officials not willing to say this? The Republican voters I know, and this is not just, I go up and knock on somebody's door. It's people I know on the daily that I talk to. They know that things aren't getting better. And, the question will be, will these people vote for a Democrat for, well, clearly things are not going well on our side of the aisle. Maybe it's time to bring a change, or are they going to vote at all? There's been talk about voter fatigue on the conservative side, and I could very well see it. When you were promised for 3 consistent election cycles that promises are going to be made and they're going to be kept, and we're now a year into the second run of this, philosophy, and things are still not getting better wholesale, it is hard to see why people would be enthusiastic on the Republican side to vote, unless it's just to preserve the Congress that they currently have, or the powers that they currently have. But I think a lot of people in Eastern Kentucky, it's not a political issue. When you cut SNAP, when you're closing rural hospitals, it's not political. It's just the daily life and death circumstances of living in a rural community. I know that some conservative pundits have said, well, I have private insurance, so I'm going to be okay. Well, closure of a hospital doesn't care if you have private insurance or public insurance through Medicaid or Medicare. All it matters is that are they getting the reimbursement money that keeps them afloat. So I think this is going to disproportionately hurt East Kentucky and rural America. And, some people will say, well, this is what they voted for. That's not. They were told that prices were going to lower. They were told that things would be better. And I think that when you talk about why did they think that, when they looked at the economy of Trump in 2019 and 2020, what was the biggest thing that happened in 2020? COVID. The economy cratered organically because of COVID, rightfully. Everybody was out of work. The entire trade system was completely run amok. And I think you had this brain fog, not from COVID, but the brain fog of just everything going on. It was so overwhelming that people do not remember how bad things were in 2018 and 2019. And I think now people are slowly remembering that stalemate and that stagnation because it is happening again. So I'm interested to see what happens in the midterms. I really do think that there's going to be a lot of rural Democrats that are going to do very well, even here in Eastern Kentucky. But I think it's the matter of being that consistent affordability message. And the things that have hurt the Democratic Party in rural areas like social issues, I've told people consistently that are interested in running for office or already running for office. The thing is, on social issues in a rural area, most people privately will agree with you. But I think the problem is when Democrats open the conversation with a social issue, because it looks like we don't know what we're talking about, that we're not being realistic to the needs of the people about affordability and lowering costs and just making a better quality of life. Now, if a Republican says something abhorrent about a certain sect of the population, about, a practice, whether it be abortion or guns or whatever it may be, then that's when you take on the offensive and you be clear about where we stand or where you individually stand. We may have different opinions. There's pro-gun Democrats, there's pro-life Democrats, whatever your stance may be. But by opening the door with a social issue, you're completely negating the main top priority of Americans is lowering cost. So I think that is where the affordability message will lie in our policy. It's just the question, will every individual candidate take that advice and run with it? Because if they do, I think they will win or come pretty darn close in areas that they realistically in the past couple of years shouldn't even be remotely competitive. So I think we will see some changes. It's just a matter of getting the right people on the ballot and getting the right team behind them.
appreciate hearing your optimism and your forward views for that. It's interesting. Just last week, I interviewed Secretary of State Michael Adams, and he mentioned that he's seen a shift. Growing up, the Democratic Party was the labor union party, the pro working class family party, but the Republican Party has kind of taken up that mantra. But you still see those roots.
I see the roots, and I think that a lot of people, the thing is when people look at Kentucky and say it cannot vote Democratic. Well, it did in 2023. It did in 2019. And it voted for Democratic causes against Amendment 2 in 2024 to completely roll back public education funding going into private schools with no oversight. In 2022, we voted down an amendment that would have completely ripped away a woman's right to choose. In whatever belief system people have on that issue, that would have completely taken the option off the table for us to even reconsider. And I think that was too extreme for Kentucky. We want to be able to make our own decisions at the ballot box, and by completely wiping that out of any consideration within a referendum in the future or by a piece of legislation, that was just a step too far. And I think when we're talking about the Democratic Party's shifting away. You can talk about when did it happen? Did you see it in 1968? Whatever year or whatever election people want to pinpoint. But I think at the same time, Kentucky have voted, in other rural states, have voted for Democratic governors, congresspeople, and senators in not a very short amount of time from now. We're talking about John Tefter in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. He's running again. We'll see where that goes. But, I was told that Governor Beshear was not going to win in 2023, that I was just having wishful thinking that his rural support would completely disintegrate because of, one, the Trump effect, and then, the issues of people blabbering about, the COVID handling that he had and everything else. And then when the returns came in, I sent them photos and said, I'm not here to say that you're wrong, but I believe you're wrong. And then when they finally called the election, I sent it to them and I said, you were wrong. I was being very hopefully optimistic. And I do believe that we have seen some slippage because, our message hasn't been always coherent. It hasn't always been stable. It has been one that is very sporadic. And I think that we have to make sure that we have the core values, but we allow politicians to deviate. The things that are going to work in West Virginia are not going to work in California. We have different priorities for a 50-state strategy that I think that we have to have. But the support of unions and, lowering costs and better opportunities for families is what we should be striving for. Now, how you get to that better reality is up to you as a candidate and whatever, comes to your state, the needs of your state and your people. But that underlying theme, I think, should be completely universal. And to the issue of, labor, shifting towards the Republican Party, I think in the last little bit I talked to a union leader that said a lot of his membership were worried about and very, celebratory of the bill that they passed that would allow no tax on tips and no tax on overtime. Well, when their check stubs came in, they were still getting deducted. To me, it seems as if that it is very much a carrot on the stick to get a lot of labor organizations to support candidates to get them through the door. And then once they get elected, that complete support of labor just dissolves completely. I've always given people this idea when you talk about labor that are supporting Republicans or certain minority groups that are supporting Republicans. I say you may get them in the castle, but they're going to up the drawbridge. They're going to be left outside. You've got them in the door, but that doesn't mean they're going to welcome you in either. And that's been the thing that I think we've seen with a lot of unions slowly but surely going back to the Democratic cause or just not endorsing a candidate, being completely neutral in elections where they used to, overwhelmingly endorse a Democrat. They've now shifted to overwhelmingly endorsing a Republican. Now they're in, this conundrum, this problem and predicament. And I think that if we have the right candidates, that labor will follow suit with us. But it's the matter of not just expecting labor to endorse a Democrat, but it is working hard to, appeal to those constituencies, not just assuming that, I can go, put on a hard hat and, get in a campaign ad and expect the union to endorse me, but I have to have teeth to my words. They have to, your words follow up your actions and your actions follow up your words. And I think that that is really the predicament that we have, is not only just saying that we promised that we would be for labor, but acting upon that as well. And that's what the Republicans have promised to do. And, right now we see union busting going on. We see, these check stubs that were supposed to be much larger for people in their pockets, and they're not really materializing that way. So I think calling those out, but also giving a clear plan of what we're for, not just what we're against.
And it's so interesting, like you've grown up and you've experienced this and you've heard from people, but you're also a college student, am I correct, studying political science?
Yeah.
So it's, I imagine like for me, people study political science and think, oh, in the future I'll run for office or do political work, but you're doing it while studying political science. How is that affecting your leadership?
It's interesting. It opens up my mind to other ideas that I previously wouldn't have thought. And I know that there's people in leadership positions, especially at the local level, that didn't go to the collegiate level, and they're running their cities and their local governments pretty darn good. But just in my opinion, going through a collegiate level of study while also being in an elected position have kind of opened up the ideas of what we have done in the past, what does work, what doesn't work, and kind of new, broader ideas that have just come to play. So, considering different issues, whether it's food deserts, healthcare unavailability, whatever these things may be, that is, new concepts for rural politics, but also considering that we have a unique position growing up in the area that we do. I love this place, but sometimes we can be our worst enemy. Sometimes we put down ourselves into the point of not really wanting to do anything, but having those new ideas constantly flowing and dealing with people from all different walks of life in a collegiate space. Coming from cities that have thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, to where we have just a little over 4,000 people. So, having those broadening perspectives of what works in a rural area, and what works in a suburban area or urban area, and making sure that we can either link those together in some form or fashion, or just see, hey, this doesn't work in a rural area when I previously thought it would. Maybe let's shift focus. So I think not just in the studies and the work and the assignments and group projects, but also just talking to people from their point of view of where they've lived and what they've experienced. So, it is a lot when you have your city council meetings on the second Monday, and, you have to go to class that morning and then drive back home and then go back to campus.
Oh, wow.
But, it's a burden that I'm willing to take for a while, because I feel as if that experience of being young in an area like this, that have consistently seen an aging population, that have, not really seen a lot of young people, unfortunately step up in the local way. A lot of them go off and they go and do great things. They become doctors, they go in the military, they do something that, completely shifts their focus out of East Kentucky. But not a lot of people have been able to come back and make a success story of it, or have been able to exploit that. So I think that just using the story that I have and carrying that with other people's concerns is really the important thing that I, have really been able to gain from, balancing that work-school life balance that I've had for the last little bit.
And you've, it sounds like you've had very positive relationships, with fellow city council members, with the local leaders here. Mm-hmm. Have you ever encountered toxic leadership in your career, and how has it affected you?
There's a lot of people that I will say, had I been 10 years older, I think I would have been taken more seriously. Mm-hmm. But also I can't blame them. It isn't, for far too long, the average expectation of a local leader, whether it's city council or school board or mayor or, even in county government, is, you settle down, you have kids, you have a business or a career where you're pretty much foundational to the community, and then you put your name in the hat. Not doing it beforehand and establishing yourself as just ideas, an experience that may not even be on paper. I have, proudly been able to do good things for the community, but has it been notated on a resume? No, because I haven't had that, textbook experience that people would typically consider. But, I've lived here my entire life for almost 21 years now. My entire family have either lived in Paintsville or Johnson County since, the 1860s, when we left Roanoke, Virginia, because we didn't, support the secession from the Union. And we were in Johnson and McGoffin counties at the time, and, this is where we are still. So, the idea that I don't have the lived experience to be able to form an opinion or a framework for a policy that will help is really tone deaf, in my opinion. There's even people in their 60s that don't have a lot of written experience, but when you throw them in a decision-making role, they can do very well. Age, in my opinion, is not a factor. It's how new your ideas are, or how willing you are to accept new ideas. Because we cannot live in a framework of the 1970s and 80s. Those years have unfortunately passed, and I get it. We live in a community that was in pretty good straits, in the 20th century. But you can't put a 20th century thought into a 24th century reality. We have to have new ideas, and whether that comes from me as the youngest person or from the oldest person on the council does not matter to me. But I have seen, instances, whether it's, being county Democratic Party chair, being on city council, or even just running for office. There's a lot of people saying, "Does he even live here?" And I'm like, yes, I live here. Just because I have a dorm 5 days a week at Morehead State University doesn't mean my legal address is here in the city of Paintsville. And I showed them my address, and a lot of these people know where I live. And it was this interesting back and forth, and I think it is that they just didn't want to have a young person in the role. They wanted somebody that, was in what they would normally call the good old boys club, but, that's not what the city of Paintsville wanted. No one else filed for writing candidacy. No one else filed for that vacant seat that I then took. So, the idea that there were better options, there were no options. So I was there to step up and do good for my community. And, we have an election next November. If you feel as if somebody else is better for that and I end up not getting in the top 6 slate, so be it. But at this moment, that was my calling, and that was what I believed was right for the city of Paintsville. And that's what over 150 people wrote in my name for. So unless those people have, concerns going into the next election of my, feasibility of being on that council of 6 and governing the city in the right way, then, that's the will of the voter and the will of the people. But at this moment, that was what was clear to me, is that if no one else was willing to step up for the city of Paintsville and put their name to the ballot and offer themselves as a candidate, I might as well have done it. And that's exactly why I'm here today. But I do think that there was an issue of age in that. And some people have been proven wrong, and that's fine. I'm glad to show them that, things are better than they seemed. That I'm not naive and I have pie-in-the-sky ideas. I'm pretty practical. I understand that there are issues in local government when you have a budget of a little over $2.5 million. There's a lot of limitations, and there's not a lot of money to go around. So this idea that I would swoop in there and, cause chaos was not to be perceived by a lot of people, because it wasn't going to happen. I knew realistically what I was going into. So I do see age being a problem, but I'm glad to see that for most people, that seems to have persisted.
When you said about if you were 10 years older, it just made me think of something I heard. One of Barack Obama's advisors shared a story that after Trump got elected, after succeeding him, that he had this thought of, maybe I came 10 years too soon. Mm-hmm. Maybe I should have come later. So it's, I know it's a different perspective, but just made me think of that when we take that step or have that calling mm-hmm. to run for office or to take initiative, you saw that calling and you went for it and you saw the time.
No, exactly. I told myself, I said, I may very well lose. Somebody else may have filed. They may appoint somebody to that seat, and I may lose. But the reality is that I was willing to put my name on the ballot. And whether people voted for me or not, I promised to serve them. And there was a lot of people that had issues that I was running as, the Democrat in Johnson County. That's what people have labeled me on Facebook if you look at the select few that always come to the comments. But I think when you look at my practice, it's not a political reason that I'm there. And even the stuff that I do in being a county chair, it's that I believe that everybody deserves a voice in the process. And they don't have to vote for a Democrat. They don't have to donate to us. They don't have to support us. But the reality is I believe that we should have every option on the table to move our city and our county forward, because clearly things are not going well as they are currently, as they were at the time. So I believe that we should have all options on the table, whether that is in a partisan way, with, Democrats running, or in the idea of just bringing every different perspective to the table in the smallest facet of government. City council, school board. They're very, in my opinion, some of the most important decisions are made there. People say, it's the most important election of your lifetime when they're thinking of a Senate race or the presidential. It very well is. But the majority of the issues that impact you on the daily, whether it's roads, issues of housing, cost of living, a lot of those things are decided at the most local level. And so that was why I decided to take that, that big leap, as a lot of people wanted to call it for me. But I was glad to jump for it because I think that we have a good group of 6 right now, and I think that there will be another group of 6 coming in January 27 that will continue to do that.
What would you say is your overall leadership style or philosophy?
My idea is, one, is that since I've not been there for a number of years, is establishing these relationships as if they've always known me. I don't want somebody to come in and have to spoon-feed me information. I don't want somebody to come in and think because I'm young or I'm new that I don't know, the situations that are at hand, whether they are severe issues or they're things that just need tweaks or need new perspectives on. And a lot of these people within city government I've known because I was with their kids in school. I knew them, just in a family setting, a personal way. So I just want them to level with me. This is a town of 4,000. You don't need to give me acronyms. You don't need to give me fancy ways of explaining it. Just give me, the root way and the root cause of the issue, and we'll fix it. I'm also one of these people that I don't like taking no for an answer. And I don't like the idea of just waiting for things to pan out. I like to have a concrete framework, and I like to see things that are practical but yet big and bold. Because we have to be able to exacerbate what we have. Because realistically, when you're dealing with an issue of utilities, available land, there's not going to be a factory just drop in Johnson County and save, the local economy. But what we do have is just our natural tourism. What we do have is very good-hearted small businesses. We have really good county and city schools. And I think that we have to absolutely expose those to the highest of their extent. So is our economy going to be big and thriving like it used to in the coal days? Probably not. But can we bring it in a framework, whether it's in the Big Sandy region or East Kentucky altogether, to where, we are a dot on the map? I've always told people there's 3 Ps on US 23. There's Paintsville, Prestonsburg, and Pikeville. And Paintsville is always the one that gets overlooked. Prestonsburg always have stuff going on. Pikeville always does. You have a college there. Prestonsburg, you have Moorhead's Big Sandy campus. We have Big Sandy right in our back door. So I think when we recognize that sometimes we have been out of the loop when it comes to development and, just making sure we maintain what we have, but also bringing in new ideas and new perspectives. We have a really good staff with our city tourism. Just a really good staff overall. I mean, utilities, when we absorbed Johnson County Water and Utilities, a lot of people are working on a very short time frame. We have, boil water advisories once a week in the county, and I think that we have to come together for the greater good, because what's good for the city is good for the county. What's good for the county is good for us. Because without the county seat of Paintsville, Johnson County wouldn't have a lot. Not to say that the county doesn't produce, they do. But given the revenue and the employment and everything else we have, I think that we have to come together. And, a lot of this bleeds over into, school allegiances, whether it's Johnson Central or Paintsville or Paintsville versus Johnson Central. And I think that we have to take off our jerseys and all of our sporting or competitive natures off when we're in these positions. Because don't get me wrong, I'm a proud Paintsville graduate. My grandparents on my dad's side, my grandma Betty and my papa, taught at Johnson Central. So I understand that dynamic. And rightfully so. I mean, everybody cares about their kid, their grandkid, whoever, and they want them to succeed in whatever facet that is. I was, really sweating bullets at Crook Recall. There's people sweating bullets on the basketball court. It doesn't matter what it is. But in my opinion, a lot of those allegiances have been to our downfall. And I think that those have to be completely stripped away. Because there's people in the city that proudly send their kids to Johnson Central, and there's people in the county that proudly send their kids to Paintsville. All of those allegiances have to be dropped, because one thing too is both school systems are in the city limits, because that's where we have the most viable land. So when we're talking about, bringing the community together, I mean that in every instance. Because, if we can't come together as a county and a city together as one whole community, then, it's not going to pan out in ways that will be preferable. And I think that that's one thing we've seen, that we're recognizing that has been to our downfall, and just coming together in whatever facet that is, whether it's grant money coming in from the county, whether it's collaborative efforts like we donated as a city $5,000 and the county donated $5,000 to offset the cost of food banks because of the SNAP debacle that they were dealing with federally. So, whatever it is to uplift the community in whatever ways we can, or just coming up with framework of strategic planning for the next couple of years. We can't just sit around and hope something big is going to come our way. We have to be realistic and pragmatic, if you will, on how to, devise our future. And I think that's the way that we get things done.
I see three key components of leadership, what I call my 3 M's, being an effective motivator, a competent manager, and a supportive mentor. So like motivator, manager, mentor. How do you view those 3 roles? And do you see them as like 3 things that are tied together?
Yeah, I do. I think when you are motivating folk, we're in a region where typically the idea of government coming in and helping is not the most pleasant idea. Whether it is as local as city council or if it be the federal government. We've always had, concerns and superstitions on it, and I can't really blame them. So I think it's to motivate people that change can happen. It is possible, but it's the matter of trusting the process or either working to change the process in the way that we do things. And that could be getting involved with a campaign or a political party, or that is just simply going to your local meetings, writing me letters, calling me, getting a hold of me or anybody else on the council or any localized government, and just giving us your concerns. I can't govern for the people if I don't know what the people care about. I can't fix a road that I don't know has a pothole. I can't fix utilities that I don't know are not working. So, I always want to be able to not just motivate people to get off the couch and vote, but get out and really be an engaged citizen. Because, that is one thing that, I think our generation and others have taken for granted that even my grandparents did. They voted in every election. They were always up to date on what the candidate stood for, what people were doing, and if they weren't doing anything, hold them accountable. And I think that we're seeing a reverse of that. We're seeing that come back a little bit. But I think in the most local level, even if it's a nonpartisan office, hold us accountable. If there's something that I have not done that you want to see done, let me know. And I've always told people that. I'm one mind, I'm one individual. I cannot decide the city's future in just my hands because, one, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. But also, I don't know what matters to every section of town. I don't know what matters to every section of the county or in East Kentucky if we're talking about something that is working with multiple different counties and city governments. So that would be what I would say about motivate. Mentoring, whether it's me seeking mentorship, because, rightfully I've not even been on the council for a year. So I think rightfully, seeking out people who have been in government of any kind and seeking out what they would suggest in certain scenarios or in certain regards or policy points, whatever it may be. Budgeting especially, that was one big thing we dealt with our budget coming up. That we just finished off of. And then mentoring, local people to realize that they can get involved in the process, whether it's young people. There's a lot of young folks I know in East Kentucky that are running for offices that they never thought they would run for because there were people like me and others that stepped up in ways that they didn't deem possible at this young of an age. But also mentoring people that may be older than me that thought that they were always shut out of the political process. But if I can do it at 20, they can, rightfully do it at the age of 45 or 50. And I think just breaking that cycle of I cannot be a part of this, this is above me, to being that this is not above you, you're equal to it. You just have to be, able to figure out what role suits you, whether it's as low as soil water commission or school board all the way up to, the presidential, whatever your aspirations are, let's be realistic, fine-tune them and make sure that you have the best fit that will not just serve you and your family well in that work-life balance, but also serve your community in the best way. And then what was your third one?
Manager.
Manager, yes. I think that one, as a council of 6, and then if there were to be a tie, which there have not been, most everything we've done has been unanimous, is, managing ourselves together, making sure that we all have the right priority and direction, and also people managing me. Not this closed door behind the scenes yuckiness, but literally just people managing what I prioritize. Whether it's people messaging me or calling me about, a pothole or, issues of drainage or whatever it may be, something that City Works deals with. Is it utilities? Are you having issues with water, with heat, with electric? Things that matter to people on a daily that normally does not seem like, a political body can fix, but we're the ones that do it. We're the ones that appropriate the money to put, the blacktop on that pothole and fix it. We're the ones that help get utilities the money to drill up a pipe, redo it, and fix the street back. So I think it's just letting people, me managing my constituents, which is everybody in the city of Paintsville, a little over 4,000 people, of what we realistically can do as a local city body, but also what I need to be doing with their problems and their concerns, or things that they just have questions about that just have not been fulfilled yet, about just the status update on things. That was a big question on the flood wall, which have still been kind of in a stagnant position, but, other things that typically we would see a lot more faster process, but because of loss of grant, because of construction cost, and the issues of inflation with a lot of things that we pay for to get things done with, just being transparent on, what things are taking so long or why things are panning out the way that they are.
How do you sort of embrace global identity or even being a global citizen in your work here locally? And in what ways do global events shape what you're doing here in Johnson County?
I think the issue of trade hurts really bad. We're dealing with issues of construction costs going through the roof, things that are typically imported into the United States. Whether you're talking about heavy machinery equipment, whether you're talking about individual parts and electronics. The typical fees that we incur with just a bit over $2.5 million, there's not a lot of wiggle room. And without grant money or private investment or what have you, we're pretty limited in what we can realistically incur when it comes to price increases for things that we typically need for city services and projects. So that is one thing that I see globally harming things. Potentially even if it's something in regard to gasoline and oil, if it's something that happens, say, in the Middle East or whatever, really just hurting the consumer, the local consumer, whether it's us needing to reimburse our fire department for diesel that they're using for a fire truck, or whatever it may be, or if it's just us having simple grievances as citizens of the U.S. with, gas prices, whatever it may be, on that front. But typically I would say just the issues when it comes to trade, and how that can harm, just our local budget, because that is things that we desperately need for projects, whether it's getting our splash pad put in before the spring to go and couple that with the city pool, or if it's just redoing roads, putting in, new piping, getting rid of the cast iron and lead piping that we've had in our ground for years, decades. Some of those cast iron pipes were put in the 1920s, so we're nearing about 100-year-old infrastructure in some areas, which is not too uncommon in eastern Kentucky, but just dealing with the issues of price increases when it comes to, fulfilling what we need to on the daily.
And what lessons do you think states like Kentucky can offer to sort of broader policy conversations, to show the rest of the U.S., but also the world, what can we offer to public policy and leadership?
I think realistically is that there has been this narrative in the last little bit that you have to have all the money and all the connections to get involved. And I don't subscribe to that idea because, there are typically, we have the history in the Appalachian region or Eastern Kentucky or Kentucky as a whole of not really taking no for an answer I remember, stories that my great-grandmother, I call her grandma, she telling me stories of my great-grandfather, Bill Blair, ended up having to work down in Breathitt County to mine coal because the Vandler mines were on strike. With the UMWA, which he was a member, but it was to the point that he couldn't afford to be off work to protest, so he had to drive all the way to Breathitt County in the 1950s to get work in the coal mines. So, I'm not too unfamiliar of us, standing up for what's right. And I think at a time with this, when families are pushed to the margins when it comes to being able to afford the basic needs that they need, and not just basic needs, but the basic practices of life, being able to afford that summer vacation, birthday gifts, Christmas. I saw that there was some commentator on Fox Business that said, don't buy grandma that Christmas gift. We can't afford it this year. Realistically, just having that basic, what would be quintessentially American way of life, always having a little bit of excess, being able to, provide everything you need for the basics of your family, but, bringing in those extra things that make, life a better way, and a better, time for you and your family, or just the community, whether it's, donating to charity or whatever it may be, and that's kind of where I talk about this, is that we have a lot of issues that I think should be addressed in Congress, but just are not right now. I think that there's a lot of issues that are being exacerbated by Congress, whether it's cuts to SNAP and Medicaid. But, there's an issue that we've seen for a long time is right to repair, which is local farmers and mechanics being pretty much relegated to sending their farm equipment or vehicles to a dealer because they're in a legally binding contract that will not let them even have maintenance on their vehicle by themselves. And that's one thing that I've seen in Congress be brought up every now and then in the past couple, 4 or 5 years. But that goes against a lot of the corporations that typically donate to members of Congress, like John Deere and, other large vehicle and machinery manufacturers. So that's one thing I've heard from a lot of folks I know down in Western Kentucky with a lot of their farmers. As well as just regular car mechanics. There's some vehicles that you're just not able to even do typical maintenance on yourself. You have to send it to the dealer. And then, when you're dealing with issues of, affordability, right now, Kentucky Power is trying to put a 15% rate hike on all consumers in the Kentucky Power District, which disproportionately is hurting Eastern Kentucky consumers of, their electrical service. And we are the highest rated individuals within that service boundary. So the poorest counties in Kentucky in their service district are the highest charged already, not counting the 15% increase that they're already trying to lobby against consumers. So I think the issue of just how expensive things have got in such a short amount of time. Just basic necessities of life have pretty much been unattainable for people. And I think, how do we get involved in that process? Find a group, find an advocacy group, whether it is inherently political for one side or the other. If it's an interest group, say that, solely based with their lobbying on healthcare or environment or whatever it may be. But you yourself, a lot of people say that, it's wasting your time to call Hal Rogers' office or call Rand Paul or Mitch McConnell's office. But every now and then, you will see things change. They've talked about this bluegrass resistance in this new Congress, Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell and Thomas Massie, most notably Paul and Massie being the stopgap for a lot of things going on in Congress right now, or at least being the sole proprietors of resistance on the Republican side. So I think that when you put the right pressure, things do change, or things just never happen that were intended to, that would disproportionately affect people. I heard that President Trump was supposed to give out his health care plan that we've been waiting on since 2016. Just this week, and because so many Congress people in rural districts were being called and exacerbating them out by their constituents about issues of cutting Medicaid, getting rid of those ACA subsidies, they canceled the press conference that was supposed to announce that big package that would replace the Affordable Care Act. So I think that when you put pressure where pressure is due and necessary, that even in a state where people say it's, gerrymandered, it's very Republican, things can still happen. when you all work together on an issue that matters to you. And that can be very different issues. It can be something that is a more conservative ideal, or it could be a more liberal or progressive sense, or it could just be common sense things that need to get done that anybody would subscribe to. But I would just say, find where you're needed and find what you want to get done and, execute a plan with the group or just advocate on behalf of yourself.
And, hearing about you talk about how these cuts have affected Eastern Kentucky from food benefits to the hospitals, and you being a leader here and also a student, I was curious about how you've seen sort of growing challenges and conflicts around diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI initiatives, like both globally, but here in the U.S. and the attacks we're seeing on it from like the federal level, but also the state level, and like the cuts to DEI funding and policy pushback. How have you viewed those, and has that impacted your work, or have you seen that as impacting Eastern Kentucky in education?
I see it impacting education in Appalachia just typically because, a lot of people assume DEI is people that do not look like you or have came from the circumstances that you have been dealt. And what I have given as the prime example to completely shift the narrative is that West Virginia University was forced under the DEI law that passed in West Virginia, or the anti-DEI law that passed in West Virginia, to completely close down their Appalachian Studies department. That is what I have told people as the main prime example of what the implications of DEI are. If people are in some ways not cognizant of other groups being affected, but look at what's happening to our set of the population. Studies that have archived so much of our cultural history of labor movements that we have participated in other issues, all of that is being relegated to being non-existent completely. And I have turned to that with a lot of people who typically would not be a fan of what typically have always been catered to as DEI. So softening the blow of what typically would be the boogeyman of DEI for people that are worried about what they've heard, and telling them really the implications that hurts on our group of the population. Poor, white, working class people is a minority in the United States. Not a racial minority, but a minority of the population when you're talking about differences in class and geography. The Appalachian region have always been underdeveloped and disproportionately and predominantly underserved, whether it is by the corporations that mine our coal, cut our lumber, or harvest industry, but also from the government in many cases. So that's what I normally use for people. But at Morehead State, it's very hard to see any positives from this. When I see people say that, we have saved post-secondary education from, cutting all these programs, because Morehead State, being on student government, they did a report at the start of the year, I believe in early September, that showed that we had the smallest international student population that we had in a very long time. Mm-hmm. And I can't really blame a family for not wanting to come into a space where their culture, their sense of place and being is completely ripped away from an academic institution that you want to send your child to. Especially when we have always been, at least in the last century, a place that you can send a family member from what is typically a nation or a place in the world that faces a lot of issues, that does not have a structured education system in a lot of places to lift them out of poverty or the subjugation they faced, and slowly but surely get educated, reside in the United States, and move their family to the United States for the betterment of themselves, that narrative has completely flipped on its head. That we want to completely isolate ourselves. And we've been down this period before. I mean, you have to look at, Woodrow Wilson and, that era. Ironically, that was in the 1920s. So, you have to, take 100 years later, same playbook, different style, different populations. But I think that when you look at this, I frankly see it as a complete just opposite of what America has stood for Now, don't get me wrong, we've had our problems. We've had our bad moments in history. But by and large, we should be a place that is literally in what have always been called the melting pot of society, that people can come to the United States or just live in the United States. If they were, their family immigrated here, they were born in the United States from their parents, that they should be proud to be here and not scared that they're relegated to the margins of society just because they're not what is considered the typical American experience in some people's eyes. And that's what I've seen in post-secondary education, but also just generally. I know that our Big Sandy Community and Technical College, they've had a lot of programs and the student services pulled from statewide funding because of that. And it's mainly just student supports, helping certain groups of the population that would be, boxed into what would be like the DEI community that is normally prescribed to in the media or what have you. So I see it as a negative impact. Some people would clearly disagree with me on that, but I just can't rightfully see a lot of families that I know that I, went to high school with. A good number of them, they either immigrated to the United States or they were the first generation to live in the United States as full citizens, or native-born citizens, that I just can't in good conscience see how any of that is good to society. That's just my worldview. I don't see how that is in any way a good for us, because we've always been known, bring us your, tired, huddled masses, that was always what we've etched into the Statue of Liberty, and that's what my family subscribed to. They were poor farmers in Germany and Ireland and Scotland. The most white you probably can get. The most Anglo-Saxon you can get, and that's just the universal experience. That's what the United States have been founded on, and what we have typically used of our principles. Now we have reverted in ways and regressed in certain ways. But I just see anti-DEI stuff as mainly just against having a collective society instead of just having a unicameral society where everybody believes the same way, everybody lives the same way. That's never been the United States. You may talk about, the colonial period where everybody had the same Protestant beliefs. Not really. When you're really looking at the main people that came over and why they came to the United States, whether it was pre-colonial or after, or you're talking about coming to the United States when we founded and after, I just have issues with that. My papa taught history and social studies in high school. He taught a little bit at Morehead State, his alma mater, my family's continuing alma mater. And that's just something I know that he was not a fan of. And people say, well, that's because he was a liberal thinker. My papa was a proud Republican. He was elated when my sister Reagan was born because they named him after Ronald Reagan. It was a uniquely American belief. And unfortunately, it has become a partisan viewpoint if you care about a multicultural United States. And that shouldn't be the case. But I think in the last little bit, we have seen that kind of isolationist rhetoric slowly rear its ugly head again. And people look at it as populism and, if it's negative, if it's positive. Sometimes populism is an inherent good, especially when people have lost their jobs and they feel as if that our country has been dealt a bad deal. NAFTA, other issues that have pulled people's realities away from them. But it also can rear its ugly head when you're trying to find an enemy to blame. Not blaming the decisions that the government have made, that we as a nation have decided to support, but trying to find the boogeyman that we can point to the blame that is not ourselves. And I think that's the main reason that we're seeing the onslaught of anti-DEI stuff, is that we're trying to find somebody that we can blame for problems we have not been willing to recognize as, our own, if that makes sense.
And you spoke earlier about the importance of finding our communities if we want to, be a leader or make change. So I want to, continuing off of that, what advice do you have for individuals, but also organizations and movements who want to put Kentucky, particularly Eastern Kentucky, on the global map and just show the world, what we have to offer here in Kentucky, especially for young people?
I will say, talk to people, not talk at them. That is one main thing that I've told a lot of people that have come with grassroots groups, come into Appalachia that are from more urban centers. You can't walk up to the door and tell somebody you're from Louisville. That's probably not going to go very well if you go up to holler and try and talk to somebody. You have to level with people. give them a real reason and a concern and a mindset that matters to them, and just hear them out. If what is going to come out of their mouth probably everything you're going to believe or something that you deem important? Maybe not. But I think that we have been in Appalachia very stereotyped and very relegated to this idea that we are very backwards, violent people that, are not civilized in society. I am in a film class at Morehead State where we look at solely films that, are focused on Appalachia, whether produced within, Appalachian folk or from outsiders. And, they always treat Appalachia, even now in today's media, almost like it's David Attenborough in a zoo. Look at these interesting specimens. And that, to me, just continues the stereotypes we've dealt with, since the Beverly Hillbillies. And you can go back even farther than that, even to the Civil War. And even before that with colonial stereotypes of Appalachia. But I think the main generalization I would give there is make sure that you know what matters to people before you come here. You don't treat it as a shock. You don't treat it as, well, that's not really, of much importance. That's really not what we came here for. Or that's really not the way that we derive our policy. Some people will talk about environmental issues and they immediately are turned off because our complete economy have been dominated by coal. In arguing to people that we need to completely subside the usage of coal, well, you already killed the conversation before you started it. You have to level with people of their lived experience. If that is where their family is drawing their money from, if that's where their men and women in their family have been employed from, you have to level with people. And that's the problem even when you talk about it in a political sense. There's a lot of times, and our governor has done very well about talking about it, is for far too long Democrats have been very good at knowing the problem, but we market it in a way that is very corporate, that is very analytical when it doesn't have to be. We talk in acronyms and in big, think tank ideas and theories and all this stuff that just completely have tone deaf to working people. And I think that's the way that we have to govern and, produce ourselves when we are, working in whatever groups to find some kind of collective action. Is leveling with the people that we want to have our knowledge and our data based upon, but also making sure that we let them know the implications of what we're doing. Hey, we're going to advocate on behalf of you. Are you okay with that? Let them know that not just we're coming in here, we're going to use you as a spectacle and we're going to, exacerbate your experiences to put on mass media or, a big campaign of, advocating for certain policy. But let them know that they can be in that process too. Because a lot of people in Appalachia have been and, I'm even still a victim of this too, that there's some things that you're like, I don't think I should deal with that. That's not for me. But just making sure that you can break that course of people feeling as if that they're helpless, that they have been so relegated to being isolated from processes of being an advocate, of being an active member in a political sense of their community. And, community can be different. That can be city, that can be county, that can be, the nation as a whole. But just making sure that not only you're taking their lived experience as it is, but also recognizing the main importance of letting them get involved as well. Not just taking their data and going home and celebrating, but also incorporating their viewpoints as well and bringing them into the fold.
I really like hearing that refrain of lived experience you're mentioning from hearing from people here in Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, but also from young people. And I was curious, thinking of lived experience and when people sharing their stories, are there any books or publications that you look to that have shaped your leadership philosophy?
Leadership philosophy, I would say that there's a couple of books that I've read, whether it's Appalachia focused or a certain kind of political bend. One of the main ones that my papa absolutely loved, and I have multiple copies of it, because my papa was a very quirky and eccentric individual. Not in a fancy way, but that's just how he organized and relegated himself to in his life. He would have 3 different copies of a book, of the same book. One he would read, One he would take notes in, and the other one he would keep as an extra copy in his bookshelf. So when he passed, we had thousands of books we had to go through, and half of them were the exact same book. But that's just the way he was, and he would always, he wrote a book in, I believe the date was 1962, about the Jenny Wiley captivity in Johnson and Floyd County and the implications of, the new frontier here in, Appalachia when we opened up from the Cumberland Gap. And he always would give me copies of this book. Every so many birthdays, he would write a thing on the front cover, and he would wish me happy birthday. And he would do that with other books, or even to my dad or my nan or somebody. And they slowly came to me after he passed, of me looking through, just remembering his handwriting in the way that he would, formulate sentences, and just really the care that he took into exhibiting himself. But the main book that he loved was Night Comes to the Cumberlands by Harry and Cottle from Perry County, pretty much talking about coming in as a lawyer and dealing with the abject poverty that was at the time. I mean, this was before the war on poverty. This was before Medicaid. This was before food stamps. I mean, we were dealing with, people being stuck in almost a 19th century way of life. No running water, no electricity, pretty much being stuck in the same stability and instability of life that they were as children in the 1910s, 1920s during the Great Depression and the economic issues there. So, recognizing where we have came from in such a very short amount of time in Eastern Kentucky. I mean, my great-grandmother went only up to the 8th grade in Van Leer, and I have had AP classes and dual credit, and I'm in college. It's only been 2 or 3 generations where the majority of our Appalachian people have been able to garner as much as we have, and in a way it is overwhelming. The amount of technology and access to new things that we've had in just a very short amount of time. I mean, we're talking about less than 100 years of so much availability and access that we've garnered. But one of the main books that I've read that I really enjoy reading was Desk 88 by Sherrod Brown. He wrote about how he was on the 88th desk in the U.S. Senate right up against the wall. I remember when I went to D.C. and they let us go up in the balcony of the U.S. Senate, and I pointed to the desk. I was like, there it is. I've seen it on C-SPAN all the time. There it is. And though he's not there, I hope he has a comeback next year. But he talked about kind of the legacy of, Ted Kennedy sitting there. And, throughout, the decades, and even though the Senate is always noted as like an archaic institution, everybody, they deliberate for hours. Not a lot of things go on. They're all a bunch of old people. It's just, the very old way of politicking that even in some European countries is very naive to the way that they govern, their parliament or their even their Senate chambers. And just talking about how different, liberal or progressive policy has persisted through the people that have literally sat at the same desk as him throughout the U.S. Senate's tenure. And that one I always thought was important to me because I always have enjoyed Sherrod Brown because, one, I live partly in WYMT and WSAZ news coverage, so I would get a lot of news feed about what he's doing in Ohio, because where we live so close to the tri-state area there with Ashland and Huntington and Portsmouth and Iron, Ohio. And I have family that live in Cincinnati and Dayton. So, looking at how he governed as kind of this working class champion in an area that, have sharply went to Republicans. And next year, I hope that we see some reversion of that, especially with the issues of, working class concerns. But, really looking at how champions of rural ideals and not just rural ideas, but just working class values, growing up in a family that didn't have a lot, but it meant everything, and I've even looked at information about Alvin Barkley, who was vice president from around the Paducah area with Harry Truman's vice president, U.S. Senator Carl Lee Perkins from Knott County. So a lot of people that came from abject poverty, not a lot, and emphasized what we have today as, an ideal that was not very popular at the time. enforced it through the halls of Congress to the Resolute desk and changed a lot of lives. That's why we have Carly Perkins Vocational Rehab. That's why we have what we had from the War on Poverty, and Carly came after the New Deal, but Alvin Barkley was Senate Majority Leader during the New Deal era. So, it's always to me very important that you look at people that came from the coal fields of Appalachia in Kentucky, rural Kentucky especially, and how we've been at the center point of a lot of good things that have come to this country. And it's not just a Democratic thing. We're talking about, even though Illinois stole it from us, literally the land of Lincoln, Henry Clay, so many different visionaries in our government have come straight from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, or what was at the time, a portion of Virginia, or, a new territory that had yet been claimed. So I think just looking at how important it is that when people tell you, the pundits and the mass media say that, Kentucky, it's going to be always relegated to Republican control, there's always going to be this overarching conservative theme, we have always proven that wrong. It is true that, yes, we have a majority Republican registration. We have voted overwhelmingly on the federal level for Republicans, but when you have the right policy, when you have the right upbringing, and taking that upbringing to level with other people's issues and what they've lived through, we've had a lot of good people come out of rural Kentucky that have been able to change lives. For, people that have persisted for 100 years after their passing, or almost 100. When you're talking about Alvin Barkley, he died in 1953, I believe, 1956 possibly. Decades later, way after, their time on this earth, being able to have a lasting impact. So that's what I look up to. And even people that are still living that are out of elected office, like Sherrod Brown or John Tefter from Montana. Just those kind of important leaders that have led the way for a lot of good things to happen for people who are typically left behind in that process.
It's fascinating hearing about those books and those readings. Are there any also leadership lessons you've picked up from like your favorite movies or TV shows or like pop culture resources?
Yes, I will say that I grew up with a family that always loved a good classic film. Always loved a documentary or a series. I would say that I have the essence of detail that you would get from a Ken Burns documentary on PBS, with sometimes the sternness of any one of the characters on Law & Order SVU. Our two cats are Finn and Olivia, so they rightfully have claim to that. And then mainly on that front, just cherishing the importance of where you come from and, looking at different films that have, challenged narratives of rural people. I know that a lot of people have had mixed feelings about, Hillbilly Elegy and other things that have depicted our area or our people, but really just recognizing the uniqueness of where we come from. And when you talk about, mass media in that sense, there have been a lot of things to downgrade us as a people without even knowing us or not even introducing us as a people, just immediately, inserting those kinds of generalizations. But, the main thing for me is taking a look at the footage and the documentaries that Apple Shop has in Letcher County and other local media archivists. My papa was a proud member of the Big Sandy Historical Society, and there were a lot of things that, unfortunately and literally died with them. Things that they held on to, ideas, and things that were never documented, but were in their mind. And I think that it's important, especially in an area where we have garnered so much when it comes to technology in such a very short amount of time, of preserving all of that. That we can live up to that. I watched Harlan County, USA about a month ago in my film class for the second time that I've seen it. And every time that I see snippets from that, it always gives me different mixed emotions, about families literally on the picket line, life or death, hoping that they can get better for themselves and their children. Especially at a time when if you spoke up against, your employer, you were pretty much just, kicked off into the road. You lost your home from the coal company, you lost your job. and that was, all she wrote about your prospects in life. So I think just really looking at where we've came from when you look at those old film reels and rhetoric that you've seen against Appalachian people, and really just proving it wrong. Ironically, the idea of people not even having shoes in Appalachia persists. I was asked that question when I went to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I was like, I'm not even that far out of the Appalachian region. This is interesting. And then my papa was asked that when he was at his graduation at the University of Kentucky in 1953, after he came back from Germany in the U.S. military. So it's those persisting things that always have tried to put us down, that have always tried to make sure that we're not involved in, the decision-making and the policy-making of how we conduct ourselves in this country, especially because a lot of those issues, disproportionately hurt our people or people like us that have been, thrown to the margins of society. That it's very important to prove those wrong and even use things that within that media source that backs up your claim. Whether it is looking at footage of Eula Hall with Big Sandy Healthcare, with the Mud Creek Clinic, and Carly Perkins. There's a lot of, floor speeches of his that's been preserved. And just looking how our communities have came together, whether for flood or, other circumstances, really making sure that we show that we are a resilient people and not just the stereotypes that we've unfortunately had to deal with for, nearly 100 years with mass media.
And you've mentioned a number of leaders you look up to, particularly local and national leaders. Are there any global leaders that inspire you?
Global, I would say I'm one of those people that I try and stay in tune with global politics, but I've always stood with the philosophy in my mind, and this even happens when people ask me to run for national and statewide positions with Young Democrats or other things, that until my people in East Kentucky are taken care of, that's my main focus until things were to persist. So a lot of times I look at what is unfortunately occurring on the global stage and I just tune it out. One, for my betterment, but also that, when there's people that live, down the street from me that probably haven't eaten a week, and looking at the abject issues across the globe, it's the same thing, but I know that I can directly impact the local. And I do keep up with the issues that happen in, the Middle East, that are happening in Europe right now, and Asia. And that's one thing that has kind of impacted our generation, whether it's the issue of Ukraine and Russia and Israel and Gaza. That's been the two most prevalent global things that we've dealt with in the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years. But I will say that it's always been interesting to me how, not really as a mentor, but just generally looking at him as an individual, how Zelensky came to power. He was a celebrity, and ironically, we have dealt with a celebrity come to the highest office in the land, and it has panned out very differently. But I will say that it's very interesting, the rhetoric against him and just how resilient of a people they are. And, that does go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and, all of that and statehood and, these continuing back and forth battles, especially when Putin came to power in 2000 as president then, when they had actual elections, not getting 99% of the vote and calling that democracy. But I do think that has been a very interesting note with me, and also the influence and influx of a lot of women coming up in the last little bit, like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. The new, I believe, Prime Minister of Japan is a female, even though she is more of on the right side of politics, even farther to the right than what would be considered a American right. So just interesting that we have, in a good chunk of the world, kind of subsided that idea of that women are not a part of the process, and it just being you are a member of parliament and you will be a leader of this nation. And seeing that kind of difference that we see in the United States, where that still seems like a barrier that we haven't been able to fully cross yet. So that's been an interesting global aspect that I've seen in the last little bit. Because typically it's been the assumption that, that you're going to have this Democratic nominee that's a woman that's going to run, and then you see the very more what would be labeled in Europe the far-right leaders, that are female, whether you're talking about, I believe the Prime Minister of Italy or President of Italy, and that kind of ideal of this kind of universal political acceptance of female leaders on a global scale, when even in the United States we're still kind of in this hope phase of it may happen, but them having these very concrete examples in the last little bit materializing.
And you're still early in college, but do you know what your plans are after you graduate and your future plans for leadership?
Well, I will say this. I hope that I am scheduled at Morehead State to graduate in December of 2027. So I have a little bit, but I know along the way that I've, considered many different options. And I'm one of those people that, knowing how things can pop up with family or otherwise, I normally have 2 or 3 options so that if one door closes, I can go through another and not just have to break down the wall, not completely pursuing one ideal and something come up and then have to completely reevaluate things, but having a backup plan. One of the main things that I've really looked at is trying to find, the effective balance of possibly law school or graduate school. That is something that my papa went to. He went for graduate school for education. I had one seminar left in his senior class to finish, and ended up not pursuing it because we realized he'd probably be a little too overqualified to teach high school education. So, we've, almost been on the cusp of that before in our family, but just never reaching it for rightful reason. That was his pursuit. But, I would love to. I have 2 parents that have worked in the criminal side of the justice system for the state of Kentucky in different facets, as well as family courts, so dealing with a lot of very emotional and very complicated ways of handling issues in the community. And that's one thing that I probably will not pursue, just because it tanks everybody around. I will say that. It's a very hard way of going, but it's very noble work, making sure that you preserve a community and keep things secure and safe. But civil law would probably be my choice if that is to be a reality. Regardless of that, I will be living here. This is not just, being elected government here and then go to college and go to grad school and move to Lexington and then, web my life over there. That's not my position. I will hopefully, unless anything were to change with family or anything else, live in Paintsville. Now, what does that entertain for me, I don't know yet. But I would like to say that I'd be able to contribute to, helping those that normally cannot help themselves, whether that's with pro bono work or in a different field, whether with a nonprofit or some other group, to be able to achieve that. But right now, not really settling for one direction, because knowing me, I need about 1 or 2 different alternatives in case something pops up.
That's good. That's great that you have that backup plan, and you, of course, have so many options for your future and what you can succeed in. I'm really excited that to hear from a fellow academic team competitor. I was at Johnson Central, the quick recall, and academics there. I was curious what your subjects were.
I'm with arts and humanities and social studies. I variated between quick recall and FPS throughout the last couple of years if we had enough people. But social studies was my main. That was the Mac Daddy of them all. And in arts and humanities, I tried to dabble a little bit in the language arts. It got too grammatical for me. I was like, yeah, we're going to leave that to the pros. But mainly social studies and arts and humanities were my 2 fields of study.
That's awesome. My sister was a leader in future problem solving in FPS, and I think they won internationals one year. And I was math and social studies, primarily social studies, and I'm like, well, that led me to studying the one subject in college that combines them, economics. So.
You can't beat that. If one goes with the other, might as well pursue it.
Yeah, it's awesome. But yeah, happy to have a fellow social studies nerd with me. And we started this interview with your 6-word story. Now I want to hear, what is your 6-word legacy? The 6 words that you hope people will remember when they reflect on you and your impact on Kentucky and the world.
My 6-word obituary statement. What would that consist of? I would hope it would be written as, he did what he could for the least. With the least among us. That's what I've always been prescribed to. My grandmother, when she was teaching elementary school, she would, right before the start or the end of the school year, she would compile lists of names of students that needed certain products or certain things at their home, whether it was food, whether it was hygiene products, clothing, whatever it would be. And she would bag them all, put them in the back of her car, and discreetly give it to the kids, because that was before they were family resource office. And my grandmother, who is literally a coal miner's daughter, she, they just open up their home to everybody in the holler and all the family to come in and eat and care for, any neighbor that needed it. And that's been an underlying theme in my life. And me and my dad are both Masons and Shriners. And I was a patient at Lexington Shriners Hospital for scoliosis. Oh. So giving back to what has given me so much has been what's important, and what has given me so much of this community. And we've unfortunately been in a situation where there's a lot of families that need a lot of help. And I hope that regardless of whatever life takes me or that path may be, that it can help people that typically are, pushed to the side or kind of left to their own device, that something in whatever I do can help them in whatever way possible.
I think, we can definitely see that. And your reflection on Eastern Kentucky, and also how you're, shouting out your family and the leadership that they've espoused, is just really inspirational to hear.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that, when you're dealing with a family that has been through a lot, one, you have to thank them for what they gave you. Mm-hmm. Things are not perfect, and when you're dealing with families that were put into small family farms, coal mining and lumber and the railroad companies, they didn't have a lot, but what they had, they used a lot of to help anybody around them. So, that's been, the family kind of ideals for a very long time, probably since that we came over to the United States. But generally, from what I've been told, at least up until my great-grandparents, at least what has been spoken to me, I know some of that has probably been lost into history, but it's been a good run, and I hope that we can continue that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing a great job continuing it. Councilmember Hazelett, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. Happy it worked out that we're both back home at the same time, and just getting to meet you has been such a great honor.
Well, thank you. I hope you and yours have a good holiday season, and hopefully we don't have a snowmageddon this year, but if we do, I hope the roads get clean for you.
Yeah, same with you. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
That wraps up my conversation with Nicholas Hazelett. As a young leader, he brings a thoughtful, forward-looking perspective to local governance, and he pushes for lofty, pragmatic goals that keep future generations in mind. I recorded this interview back home at my parents' house in Johnson County, which made the conversation feel even more special. And we actually didn't even stop talking when the mics turned off. Nick and I kept talking about what's happening back home, and then my cousin Zaif Hussein happened to drop by. Zaif's also a college student, the same age as Councilman Hazelett. He's at the University of Pikeville. And it was just great to hear the both of them talk about what's going on back home and their love of Eastern Kentucky, and to hear them bounce ideas off each other was just electric. I wish I was able to record that part of the conversation and share it with you as well. Just wanted to shout out Zaif. My next episode drops in March, and it features Kelly McManus, the Vice President of Higher Education at Arnold Ventures. Until then, remember to live local and think global, fellow changemakers.